Okay, Mayor, we are live on YouTube.
All right. And I have 5 a.m. All right. I will, at 5 p.m. Welcome, everybody. And good evening. And we've got our special meeting for the Federal Way City Council tonight. We're going to be discussing the 2020 classification and compensation study. Before we do that, let's rise for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
United States of America,
and to the republic
for which it stands,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Welcome, everybody. So we're going to get started here. We've got we'll have a staff introduction here of our HR manager, Gene Stanley, and then we'll have a consultant presentation by Cabot Dow and Associates. This is for the 2020 classification and compensation study. And then after that, we'll have an opportunity for City Council questions and discussions. With that, I'll turn it over to Gene.
Good afternoon, Mayor Farrell, Council President Honda, and council members. So following an RFP process we did, the city engaged with Cabot Dow and Associates in June of 2019 to conduct the classification compensation study, as well as a workload analysis for our non-represented staff, our Teamsters group, and our Police Support Services Association members. We did anticipate the study to be completed in the first half of 2020, but unfortunately, due to COVID, they had difficulty obtaining the information from our comparable agencies. So unfortunately, it did get delayed until now. So tonight we have Cabot Dow and Alex Sheets with us, and they're here to provide you an overview of the study results.
All right. Mr. Sheets, you want to introduce your team?
Good evening, council members. Cabot Dow is listed as my name. I think we shared a link, so that's Cabot listed as me there.
That's right. Okay.
Thank you for taking the time this evening to look at this study. And thank you for your patience as well. I know the staff has been eager to see the results of this, and we've been eager to wrap it up, but as Gene mentioned, it took a while to get some responses from some agencies that were, with staffing issues due to COVID. We just had a hard time getting some of that information. So once we finally rounded everything up, we were able to put this together and then present that to you tonight. We have presented these results to staff and have worked with the management and HR staff along the way to just kind of shepherd this very large report through the process. As you've seen, it's nearly 200 pages. So with that, we'll get started. And I'm not sure, Gene, if you have the PowerPoint up, but I guess I should just put it up so I can control that. So
yeah, I don't have it up.
Okay, let me put that up here. Okay. So let's put that on our slideshow view here. All right. So does that look good for everybody?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So this study started back in 2019. The city issued an RFP for a salary study, as well as a classification review and a workload and organizational analysis. The last study that the city had performed was back in 2008. And so it had been quite a while since any kind of study like this had been performed. And Cabot Dow Associates was selected, and we were very grateful to be selected and to work with you on this project. The scope of work included a job classification and analysis and update, where we reviewed all of the job classifications. We selected and surveyed some comparison agencies to look at who the city is competing with for talent resources. We also conducted an exploratory organizational and workload analysis and then conducted the salary survey. We've also provided some recommended action steps and implementation costs based on city compensation policy, philosophy, and resources. So as we mentioned, we like to work very collaboratively with your organization and with your staff. We worked with HR, we worked with your management team, we worked with staff at large as well. We held many meetings. You talked about some of the different aspects of the study and some of the ideas we were thinking of, and worked with them throughout the process, and ensured that we had some good communication going throughout it. The management and leadership team provided direction to us and reviewed our ideas. They gave us feedback about the analysis, about selecting comparable agencies, and provided information about resources and some of the technical data. So we felt that it was, really a group effort to complete the study. As we mentioned, the study components included the classification study, the workload analysis, and a salary survey. And one of the things that we included in the report that was unfortunately missed in the version that you received initially includes a scope of work verification. So we simply went through our proposal in response to the RFP and talked about how we met all of those aspects of the scope of work. So that I think has been sent to you. And as well as the report also includes some appendices related to the various study components. So the first aspect was the classification study. We started with issuing position analysis questionnaires, or PAQs, to each staff member. This questionnaire asks questions about the distinguishing characteristics of their jobs, what the essential job functions are. We tried to ascertain what the minimum qualifications were for the position, if they needed educational degrees or a certain number of years of experience, working conditions, licenses, and regulatory requirements. And then we also use that information to look at what other agencies are doing as far as those similar job functions. So we use this as a tool for reviewing the position descriptions, for making changes, and using it as a framework for reviewing the position matches ultimately for the salary survey. We revised the job descriptions and updated them where they were necessary, although we didn't find that there was any need for major changes to classifications. And as I mentioned, we actually went out to our comparison agencies and looked at some of their similar job descriptions to see if there was anything that needed to be changed. And we found that they were largely current and appropriate. We do recommend that the city regularly review position descriptions that might be annually during a performance evaluation. And, the city is certainly encouraged to use the same type of PAQ that we used for this study. I am going to turn it over to Cabot Dow now to talk about the staffing and workload analysis. This was quite a large and big part of the project. So I'm going to turn it over to Cabot to let him explain how that part of the study worked.
Good evening, everybody. I'm reminded of how the COVID has been a benefit to Alex and me during this process, because of the extra time we had to dive deeper into the workload analysis component of the project. We probably have about 600 hours invested in this project, and maybe 30%, 25% to 30% of the project was dedicated to the workload analysis. And the workload analysis, as it read in the RFP, was not defined precisely as to what it was, what it would look like, and so forth. So with the experience that Alex and I have had with cities throughout the state of Washington, and particularly in the Puget Sound area, we used the broad discretion that we had here to turn over a lot of stones. And one of the things that came out was how to match up the goal of determining whether city departments are understaffed vis-a-vis the comparative organizations that were selected. And this obviously is not an exact science, and there's different approaches. And when we say the scope did not include a full in-depth analysis, I would say that it was more in-depth than originally anticipated, primarily because of the time we had to keep working on it. And once the comparable cities were identified, then we could really sink our teeth into their budgets, the way they evaluate their workload compared to how Federal Way, metrics that Federal Way uses in its budget process, and as to activity and as to staff and so forth. So this obviously was powered by purpose, and that was the looking to what we're going to do with this information, because it's one thing to collect information about staffing and workload, demand for service from the community, and it's another thing to decide how it's going to impact the future. So we looked at the different types of workload analyses that were being used across the country in projects of this nature. And surprisingly enough, there are not a lot of workload analysis projects when it comes to cities. And then on top of that, there isn't a standardized approach for evaluating workload, and staffing and so forth. So we teased out of the research that there are three basic approaches to workload analysis, and one is a look at the number of FTEs to population ratios, which is typically referred to as a per capita analysis. And this type of analysis is, as it would probably be obvious, the most simplistic, kind of analysis, where you take your full-time equivalents for your city as a whole, but more importantly for each function in the city, and you match it with the population being served. And we have, of course, charts and graphs, or primarily tables and charts, to compare these different cities in the area as to their per capita staffing. The second approach is this authorized budget analysis, which is sometimes referred to as a minimum staffing analysis. What staff does it take to meet the demands and the priorities that the legislative body gives to the various functions? And the authorized budget analysis is one which I think sets the table for looking at the budgets at your comparative organizations, looking at what their priorities are when you divide up the pie, as far as revenues, translating them into expenditures and services in the budget. So we look at the budgets in the various organizations, and we looked at how they compare to Federal Way and how their priorities and staffing line up with Federal Way. This third approach is this a demand analysis, in other words, an actual workload analysis where metrics are used to look at well, what is the demand for service and what is the staffing level to meet that demand? You know, is it numbers of miles of street? Is it numbers of catch basins cleaned out? Is it the number of cases in the court is handling? You know, and this type of analysis is quite detailed, and it's clear that there isn't a standardized way of looking at this, but this is one of those types of situations where probably more data is better than less data, because you get insights into how others are looking at their staffing and their patterns. So prioritizing staffing issues led us to making some recommendations for addressing what I would consider to be more of a factual framework as to how Federal Way's workload and staffing compares to that in the area, and the area was defined by a recommendation from that I made to the leadership team, and then a discussion that Alex and I had with the leadership team as to what are representative cities for comparing staffing, and what are the comparison cities for comparing salaries, because the salary survey piece of this study was a significant purpose-driven issue to be competitive with those agencies that we, City of Federal Way, compete with for labor. So there was a consensus after we set up this framework that we would use Auburn and Burien, Kent, Kirkland, Lakewood, Puyallup, and Renton. And I think this is a very, very representative group of cities, and it gave us a good avenue to take the classification work that was done, the updating of the job descriptions, and matching those job descriptions with these agencies, and also a framework for looking at the way they evaluated their staffing and measured their workload versus Federal Way. So as as the staffing comparisons is concerned, we broke the various departments down, or the study down by the various departments and functions, and compared Federal Way's FTEs complement to that of the other cities, and it's pretty apparent that Federal Way staffing is light as a general rule compared to other cities, and these particular cities were looked at using the structure and the functional organization of Federal Way. So we looked at information technology, compared to information technology functions. We looked at emergency management compared to emergency management, economic development compared to economic development, human resources compared to human resources, and so forth. So as we walk through these various functions, you know, the general direction that we get is that whatever resources Federal Way has to meet the demands for service is on the light side, and that is a factual depiction, with the exception of police, public safety, where it would indicate that the demand for the services that are associated with police is greater in Federal Way than that in the other cities. And so then that gets into crime statistics, and it gets into trends and the very broad functions that the police department performs. So we looked at the various functions, the various departments, and you see Park and Recreation, for example, here at 38.46 per thousand population Federal Way versus an average of 51.3. And we use the median also so that we could wash out outliers as far as statistical analysis is concerned. So we looked at Public Works, we looked at each one of the functions in Public Works operation, and lined it up with those in the various cities in the area. And you'll see in the tables in the report more detailed numbers as it pertained to these functions. So,
I did want to add that we did make adjustments for those functions that other cities might have that Federal Way doesn't, such as utility, water, and wastewater. And I believe we made an adjustment for Burien because they contract with King County for police. So
for fire, we would make adjustment, of course, for the cities that don't provide their own fire service, and so that we can have an apples to apples comparison. The demand analysis, which is the most detailed and quantitative type of analysis, presents the challenges of standardizing the format so that some decisions can be made with regard to whether or not demand for service in Federal Way in these various functions is similar, greater, lesser. And so we are suggesting that if the city wants to do a demand analysis, that we bring the department heads to the table to each design their own questionnaires, so that when they converse with the various cities about their workload, they're using the same metrics, they're using the same nomenclature, because it's very apparent in studying these budgets in these various cities and their staffing and their measurement of services, that each one has its own way of doing it. You take one city will do it in a very quantitative way, another city will do it in a very qualitative way, and then you get a city like Puyallup, for example, that's kind of a mix of qualitative and quantitative analysis. So, conclusion wise, overall, Federal Way provides services with 1 to 1.5% FTE per capita, staffing less than the areas survey cities. And this chart is a summary of the source for this conclusion and the metrics that would support this conclusion. The far right-hand column is the most significant in that this is the column that takes out fire from Kent, for example, because they're served by the Regional Fire Authority. Renton, same, take out the fire. Auburn, same. So the adjusted column on the far right would take that into consideration. Burien, take into consideration that not only their fire department is provided by another agency than the city of Burien, so is their police function as well. So the average in these jurisdictions of 5.04 FTEs per capita and versus Federal Way's 3.49 is the begins a conversation as to how Federal Way staffing compares to that of the other cities. We looked at relative property tax base. In other words, we're not dealing with a vacuum here when the legislative body is developing their budget as to what resources they have to work with. Overall, Federal Way property tax revenues are well below the average of the area survey cities, as shown by the tax rankings, and the bottom line being the property tax per capita, far right-hand column, whereby the average is $232.63 per capita compared to Federal Way's $111.42. And yet Federal Way has a broader demand for services than the average. Retail sales comparisons are not quite so dramatic, but this was pre-COVID when this study was launched and these figures were generated. So it would be interesting to see how the numbers would change a year from now. But Federal Way's total retail sales generated are slightly below the average. It really is a little more than slightly, but relative to property tax, as shown by the retail sales rankings in the table below. So we like to look at rankings when it comes to comparative statistics. So as far as the workload measures are concerned, looking at the 2019 budget, the metrics for all departments suggested by the directors were looked at. We did a questionnaire. Workload and efficiency metrics were looked at. Deeper analysis needs to be looked at of workload measures that are not included in the scope of the study. So that's about as far as we could take it, but we feel like the tools that were provided set the table for some important decisions, and whether or not they affect council priorities is another discussion, because that, of course, is fundamental.
And thank you, Cabot. And then from there, we're going to jump into, or actually there's some more. You wanted to talk about those recommendations.
Well, I think that I probably touched on the basic recommendations, but when you do a study like this, you always feel like you leave some stones unturned. And to go forward, we suggest that the city revisit its philosophy, values, and policies as it pertains to staffing, and then the city look at this information to determine whether there's enough to make decisions, or whether or not there needs to be further research done by the departments themselves. And I will say that the point of diminishing returns sets in at this point, it seems to me, because the third bullet here begins to take over, and that is, well, what does the council feel are its most important values and services, and how are those going to be ranked? And that and addressing or distributing funds based upon that analysis is quite different from one of the charts that we provided, which said, okay, well, you could approach staffing by using kind of like professional football, where you draft based upon the least endowed department or team, relative to other teams. So, for example, IT would be right at the top as far as addressing staffing issues. If you just went by an analysis based upon relative staffing to other agencies for the demand for the IT services in those other agencies. And then you might have a department like city attorney, for example, which might be on the lower end as far as need for additional staff, relatively speaking. That's always dangerous discussion, but I decided I'd just go ahead and say it. So recommendations begin to get into the area of what are you going to do with this information, and which analysis makes the most sense to the legislative body.
Okay, so it might seem like the workload analysis is a bit of a detour as we go back to the salary study, but they are all related, of course, because people are really at the heart of all of these questions, and we need staff and we need people to accomplish these goals that we have and to provide services, and and how will we reward those people and compensate them for the work that they do for us. So now we segue into the salary study portion of the report, and from the work that we did with the classification analysis, we used those revised job descriptions to make sure that we were comparing the current jobs and descriptions with other agencies. We compared the positions based on the key factors that we mentioned previously in the classification analysis, such as autonomy, decision-making, the level of expertise, certifications, and et cetera needed for that position. And we generally matched positions based on kind of an 80% match. It's an art, often more than a science, but we compare some of those factors, and if they match at an 80% level, then we consider that an appropriate match for the comparison agency. And we were able to benchmark 103 out of 120 positions, which is a pretty good success rate. That also indicates that the city doesn't have as many unusual positions that were hard to match in the market. So that's a good position to be in. We did not look at additional compensation items like health benefits, paid leave, retirement contributions, longevity pay, or premium pay. They were not part of the scope of this project, but should be included at some point down the road in a total compensation discussion. We looked at 11 comparison agencies, those cities that Cabot mentioned earlier that we used for the workload analysis. We looked at organizations with like personnel, employers, similar sizes and services. We looked at a kind of a bracket of 40% below and 80% above in terms of the city's population and assessed valuation. This is a practice that many arbitrators use when looking at labor agreement arbitrations. So we feel that this is kind of a tried and tested model of selecting organizations for comparison. We also looked at geographic proximity. So we looked at organizations within King and Pierce counties. And then we also considered talent pool competition. We heard a lot from management staff that there's competition for positions like engineering and other technical jobs with organizations such as Sound Transit or Lake Haven Water District. So to that end, we did include those agencies in there. So we used the cities of Auburn, Burien, Kent, Kirkland, Lakewood, Puyallup, and Renton. We also looked at King and Pierce County, and then Lake Haven Water and Sewer District and Sound Transit, specifically for some of those more specific and technical positions. And the detailed results are included in the report with each position and the comparison positions that we matched with in the other agencies, as well as the salaries at the minimum, the median, and the maximum of the salary range. And generally, the city pays lower salaries than the comparable market for comparable positions at the midpoint. In fact, 3/4 of staff were more than 5% below the market at any given point in the salary range. So at the minimum, the midpoint, and the maximum of each of those salary ranges. 5% in the compensation industry tends to be kind of the gold standard as far as whether or not a position is within the market. So being over or more than 5% below means that you are out of market. Less so at the minimum point of the salary ranges is that on average, most of the city's benchmark positions were 4% below the market at the minimum point of the salary range, but they become more out of the market as we go up the salary range. And as a reminder, we weren't looking at individual salaries per se. We were looking at the salary ranges, the adopted budgetary salary ranges of each position. And so, as you can see, they become more out of market as we go up. 6% below the market at the median of the salary range, and then 7% below the market at the maximum of the salary range. We found that 53% of the benchmark positions are more than 5% below the market salary range when we aggregated the averages of the minimum, median, and maximum of the salary ranges all together. A lot of words here. Again, this is just expounding more on what I summarized, that 3/4 of staff are more than 5% below the market at any given point on the salary range. And to go further than that, 1/3 of staff are more than 10% below the market at any given point on the salary range. So some significant positions below the market at that point. At the market salary median, we found that 8 positions were more than 15% below the market median, and then 11% were more than 15% below at the market maximum, which indicates to me that there's more of an issue with the city's salary ranges at the maximum of the salary range than they are at the minimum. So you're closer in line to the market at the minimum of each salary range. You're starting to get off of the market when you get to the maximum. We did find a few positions that were more than 5% above the market aggregated average. Those were by and large director positions. Those positions are paid at a flat salary rate, whereas the market tends to pay a salary range even for directors. So that was one of our recommendations, that the city adopt salary ranges for directors as well, because that's what the comparison agencies tended to do as well. 31% of the benchmark salary positions are within 5% of the aggregated average and are considered within the market. So there are several salaries or several positions that are within the market there. Let's see. We also looked at the city's formal pay structure with a 26% spread between the salary range minimum and the maximum, and that doesn't appear to be unusual for the market. I will say that adding in Lakewood Water and Sewer District, Lake Haven Water and Sewer District, and Sound Transit tends to skew some of these results a little bit, because both of those agencies have very large spreads between their position salary range minimums and maximums. It's 50% for Sound Transit, for example. So that creates a little bit of irregularities within the results. We do tend to use medians instead of averages to try and rule out some of those high figures in there and try to balance that out a little bit. So that's kind of a really broad overview of the salary range without getting, the salary study without getting into some of the specifics that are within each position. But at this point, we've presented this information to staff, and now here we are with the council presentation. All of this information, of course, has to be taken into account in budgetary and current circumstances such as they are. But we do encourage the city to consider policy guidance going forward and adopting some kind of compensation policy or philosophy to help guide future discussions regarding compensation. As I mentioned, kind of the golden standard is to have a pay level of plus or minus 5% of the median, whether that's at the midpoint of the salary range or the maximum of the salary range. We did provide a suggested sample salary schedule that would benchmark and kind of reposition the salary ranges to the median, the market median of the maximum point of the salary range, since that seems to be where the city was the most off. And in the type of salary schedule that the city currently uses with steps, in government, everybody tends to end up at the top step anyway. So that's kind of where we are really measuring to. As far as base pay, we would encourage the city to consider how base pay is set. The recommendation that we provided for implementation really uses market value as a guideline versus use value. Use value refers to internal equity. So what does administrative assistant one, what should an administrative assistant one make compared to an administrative assistant two and an administrative assistant three, and so forth? We believe that the market should really be the guiding factor, but we can find patterns within the market as far as how we determine what positions are paid to relative to each other. And we did make some adjustments in that recommended salary schedule to preserve some of that internal equity. We also would encourage the city to look at variable pay, things like incentives for education or other types of duties. Those types of things were not looked at in this particular study, nor was total compensation, but that is an important factor within looking at compensation for employees. So, what's the importance of wages versus benefits? Some agencies feel that it's really important to offer benefits to employees, and so they're willing to be a little different from the market in wages as long as benefits are provided, and then vice versa as well. And of course, you have to consider your resources, how to attract the talent that you need based on the available resources that you have and what the priorities of the city are in terms of programs and services and goals. And then we also recommend that the city regularly measure the salaries of staff on a regular basis every 2 to 3 years. That doesn't have to be all staff like it was this time around, but looking at a select sample of staff to make sure that you're staying on track with your goals. So with that, I know it's a lot of information to put out there, but we're happy to answer questions, to go back through the slide if you wanted to look at something more.
Okay. Thank you very much for that comprehensive presentation. Councilmember Asefa Dawson, do you have a question?
Sorry. Yes, I do. Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted clarification for my understanding. On page 25 of your presentation. So the second bullet, the 4% below market and then 7% below the market at the maximum of the salary range. So when we're talking about range, we're talking about steps, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So as you go up on the step from A to F or whatever, those percentages change, right?
Correct. You're getting more below the market as you go up.
As you go up, yeah. And then you also, I think you said when we're looking at the director's salaries, then they don't have a range, it's just fixed. Is that what I heard you say?
That's correct.
But I think, and you can correct me, when we were doing the budget and going through the budget, the book, the proposed budget book, I kind of remember seeing the directors having like maybe an A or a D or something by their salaries. Was I looking at it wrong then? Or if you can help me understand that. Now I'm trying to look for it and I don't. Yeah, so there was letters behind, at their grade, like 58D or C or whatever. So what are those letters then if they're not steps?
Because they're at a flat rate, we have to set them up in the payroll system. We have to tie the salary to a number. So for directors, we just used 58, and then we put it as A, B, C, D. So each director is in their individual slot because they could potentially be making a different flat amount.
So that's different from what I see with other staff. Then is that what I'm hearing then?
Correct.
Okay. All right then. Thank you so much. That was my question.
All right. A good one it was. Thank you very much. Councilmember Kraft, and then Councilmember Baruso.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is, you talked a little bit about if we aren't able to get to plus or minus 5% of the market rate, we should consider we could consider incentives like benefits. And you mentioned education. What other benefits, if you know of any, what other benefits have you seen employers give out?
There's longevity is one. So, offering incentives, or, extra pay, a flat rate percentage, at the 5, 10, 15, 20 year mark. Education is certainly one of them. And Cabot, feel free to chime in based on what you've seen.
Yeah, I'd say deferred compensation matching was starting to show up more before the COVID hit.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
And I would say that the Seattle market, it tends to be a pretty hot market. The Seattle-Tacoma Metroplex market, at least relatively speaking, I'd say. So it's obvious that competing for labor is a big challenge for most of these agencies.
Okay. All right, Councilmember Baruso.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Alex and Cabot, for the presentation. So I did have a question on the incentives, which kind of made it clear. But I had a question on the, again, could you go back to explain the total compensation again? Were any agencies, was total compensation used at all or just base wage? Or was it a combination?
No, just base wage. We did not look at total compensation.
Okay. That's what I was kind of looking for too. Thank you.
All right, Council President Honda.
Thank you. When you compared directors' salaries to other cities, did you compare the police chief to the police chief?
Correct.
Or
Mhm.
so each director was compared to the director in the other city or at Sound Transit in Lake Haven?
Where it was comparable, obviously, we're not going to have a police chief in Lake Haven, but where it was comparable, we looked, and we used the organization charts as well to make sure that it made sense, because there are different structures where, on Auburn, for example, there's one director that's over both community development and public works. So we were trying to make those positions as most comparable as possible for what duties they were actually overseeing.
So then in Auburn, would the community development director and the public works director still be considered as we would consider directors? Would they be assistant directors to the director that oversees them?
I'll skim through, I'll head over to my report right now and look at that. But I believe we would compare them to the assistant director if they were performing similar positions.
Okay.
So put that up. And if it was too different, we didn't compare them. So we're pretty conservative in how we match positions. So if it was just too different, we would not match them. So in Auburn, they do have a director of public works that we did match them to, for example. But in other cases, we were conservative in how we matched.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Let's see here. Councilmember Suffolk Dawson, did you have another question? Okay.
I'm so sorry. I forgot to put it down. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Councilmember Kochmar.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm wondering, Cheeks, do we have any lower level employees that are below the level that should be brought up percentage-wise per year to be at the end level? For example, if we have some salary ranges, some folks that are below where they should be, and if you do a straight 3% or 4% or 2% straight across the board, falling further behind. So I'm wondering if there are any levels to be brought up with an extra percentage point over the several years.
I'd have to look into the specific, I can't think of any offhand, but what we're recommending as far as implementation goes is we recommend that if somebody is within the new salary range that we're recommending, that they stay within that salary range and then move up to the next step within that salary range at their normal, performance evaluation. So if somebody is below the salary range, the recommended new market salary range, they should be brought up to that minimum. That being said, if there are any that are significantly below, that could be phased in, so that it's not quite such a big step. But that's kind of the general rule that we say is having people kind of phased in, brought into their new salary ranges, not necessarily just an across the board percentage increase.
So, Ms. Sheik, my second question is within the range, and if you have a performance evaluation and the I'm not quite sure how Federal Way does it. I haven't looked at it for so long, but you have a step increase of, let's say, 5%, and you reach all your goals. The step increase of percent, is that in addition to a COLA?
That would be in addition to a COLA.
Okay, so what happens when person who is doing a job and they're at the top of their range, there's nowhere for them to go because step increase. So all they get is a COLA increase.
Correct.
There's no, that's hard for people when they're at their top of the range is, and it's just COLA. It's a difficult place to be.
It is, and that's partly why we recommended that the city match to the top end of the range, to make sure, because that's in these types of salary schedules, that's where everybody ends up eventually if they have the longevity with the city, and if they've been staying with the city for a long time, like many of your employees do, they're going to end up at the top eventually. And so that's why we recommended matching to the top, because that's where everybody's going to be. That's, unless you're adopting incentives, performance incentives for those people who are at the top of the salary range, then that's just kind of the nature of public employment, is you are going to get to the top of your salary range. And being a former public employee myself, I experienced that as well. And that's part of the nature of the business.
Sure. So, Ms. Shi, we have a way of moving that salary range then to be in the entire level to go up, so that, when you get to the top of the range, you just don't stay there for that. When you're saying to match it, are you saying to raise the salary ranges each year to match the base that you're using?
Yeah, well, that's what would happen in a compensation study. And that's what we're recommending in this one, is that you would actually move the range to match the market. So
okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're working
that helps,
and you get to the top of that, and then then you reassess that according to the market, and the market says the top of that range should be higher, then you should adjust that range.
Yeah, you'd hate to have someone sit there for 10 years at the top of the range and wait for the salary to come along. It's further. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Tran.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Dow and Ms. Seek, for this information. So this is a salary survey, and it does not include the employee's benefits or compensation. Would it make sense for the council to wait for the other piece of the puzzle before we make any type of, implementation to address this salary survey?
Kevin, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that. I mean, from my experience, level benefits seem to be pretty comparable across the board, especially if you are using something like AWC for benefits. They tend to be pretty comparable. But I would say that it would be important for the city, before you do that, to kind of figure out what are the different pieces of total compensation and how are they important compared to the salary, in addition to that. So I don't, Cabot, if you wanted to weigh in on that at all.
Yeah, I because employers tend to favor total compensation comparisons. I tend to lean, in that direction, feeling that that's where the more complete analysis is, because what has a tendency to show up is where an organization has an edge in compensation. It will show up, for example, matching deferred compensation. If they have that, that's going to show up. If they have the longevity system that pays, let's say, something extra at 15 years, 20, 25 years of service, that's going to show up. If there's a vacation schedule, or a paid time off schedule that is more friendly to the employee as far as time off is concerned, that's going to show up. It really is a matter of what the organization wants to use as recruitment tools and retention tools. Once in a while, we'll run into a city that pays 100% of the medical, for example, premiums, because they want to use that as a retention tool or a recruitment tool, and that's going to show up. So I tend to lean in the total compensation, and like Alex says, it's not difficult to get this information because it's all public, and because it's definitely when you're looking at cities surveyed annually by the Association of Washington Cities.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Council President Honda.
Thank you. And I don't know who would answer this question, but has the city of Federal Way always had salary like salaries since the beginning when we became a city until the Great Depression? And then did it get worse after the Great Depression? I know that we lost employees that we haven't necessarily hired back, like in parks, but were our salaries about the same level as compared to other cities before the Great Depression? Does anyone know that?
I think Gene would be in probably the best position to discuss that. And I think we mean the Great Recession. The Great Depression was.
Oh, did I say depression? Oh, I thought I said recession. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We haven't been around that long.
Oh, exactly. Okay, so Gene, you want to talk about that? Because I know that we used to tether that people really talk about the way where we were about our prior philosophy. And I think the council president has a very good point here by way of question. Can you talk about this a bit?
Well, I can try and pull from some memory. You're talking about a lot of years, but it seemed to me there used to be kind of a standing policy of being within the 50 percentile of the market, and there would be periodic studies to make sure the positions were staying at the 50 percentile. But then when the recession hit in 2008, which is when we did the last study, we weren't able to fully implement that, and positions were already behind. And then on top of that, we weren't able to give them annual wage increases either for, I think, a good 5 or 6 years. So other agencies were still giving at least, 2 to 3% wage increases each year. So we just kept falling behind further and further and further each year.
Yeah, I think Council President Honda and the rest of the council, I do think that from my own knowledge, being on the council since January of 2004, 16 years, I can tell you that that I think we did a much better job as a city keeping linking with the market. And it was when we shed all those, when the Great Recession started in 2008, where we froze things. And then, going 6 years without a COLA, I think really did dramatically alter our market position. And it's just not sustainable. And so that's really the position we're in now. That was one of the reasons why I've been trying to, since January of 2014, that's why we've been consistently trying to add COLAs wherever we can to try to, raise the tide, if you will. But I think we do need to get surgical, obviously, and get into some of these positions and eliminate discrepancies.
Mayor, I have one more question.
Of course, yes. Go ahead.
So if we were to hire more people to reduce the workload, is that instead of giving step increases for the next few years, is that what staff would prefer, or would they prefer to continue the high workload that they have because we have such a reduced staff compared to other cities? Where are we headed? What is the plan to make our employees happier and keep them instead of having them go to Lake Haven or Sound Transit or other cities?
I think adequate, just to be completely candid with you, I think adequate compensation is at the very top of that list. And I think when people feel like they don't, like they're not being valued, that's where you have morale issues. And I can tell you that it really does affect morale not to be able to adequately compensate them to other neighbors. And when they feel that way, I've had several people come, several workers as they're about to leave, just saying, well, I got $800 more a month just by going to this agency, or $1,000 more a month going to that agency. And we can understand that. But I think the first and most important thing is to get the compensation right. And then a lot of it is, I think that the council and the administration, we've been very collaborative together, especially in this last budget process, to try to adjust some of the workload issues and some of the priorities. So I think that tweak is occurring. And when we do hire in new positions, this is the irony here, is when we do hire in new positions, either at a director, manager, or at some of these specialty positions, they're hired at the correct market rate. So people that are longer term here, are still sort of working to get back in that median. I hope that provides some direction. But I can tell you that morale suffers when people don't feel like they are adequately compensated.
Mayor, I'd also like to add, just so the council's aware, when they're being paid under market, it's also impacting their pension long term. Because under the Department of Retirement Systems, they do look at the salary to calculate their pension. So it's not impacting them just now, it's going to impact them in the future as well.
And I really think that just from an ethos, from an organizational ethos and a way to operate, I think you should only bring on the people that you can adequately compensate. I think one of the things you would not want to do is bring on more people and at the expense of everybody else. I think that's going to create probably greater turmoil turnover and likely turmoil. We have Ade who has asked to speak. Ade.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to make sure that when Jean mentioned 60 percentile, that the council fully understand what that means. Because when we do salary study, the city has deliberately made the decision that if somebody's making 50,000 in Auburn, we're now going to pay that person exactly 50,000 by deciding to do or to stay within 60 percentile. So I think it would be really important for the council to fully understand that decision that was made as part of our policy. Secondly, I think as Jean explained, in 2008, just like now, when the salary study was done, and that is part of the frustration for so many employees. The salary study was done, was released that, oh, you are underpaid, blah, 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 blah. And because of the depression, nothing was done until 2014 with the new mayor, when, as Mayor pointed out last year, when some pay increases were made. Not only at that time, we did not implement the salary study recommendation because we didn't have money, but we just gave COLA. And also for so long, those employees did not receive COLA. That is just the unrepresented employees. Represented employees during the negotiation, they often compare when they are negotiating with the city, say, okay, this is what we should get because so is getting this. This is what we should get because so is getting this. So the bargaining group is comparing the market rate with their negotiation. But because the non-rep do not have representation, so that non-rep of your employees are the ones that are left behind. Thank you, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Okay, Council, any other discussions?
I have one more question.
Please.
So, are you working on a plan with staff to compensate our employees and to retain them longer here in the city? Is there a plan moving forward? I guess I'd like to know, because as a council, we look to staff for their recommendations, and so I'd like to know, is there a plan, and where are we headed? Thank you.
Okay, so the plan as set forth, I want to say this, I don't want to be snarky when I say this, but the plan was to get a full 3% to the organization this year and the 3% next year. And really the idea was a high tide raises all boats, to use the Keynesian economic metaphor, and the idea was to raise the tide of all the boats, as it were, all the employees, and then go in surgically, over time and start correcting discrepancies as we saw them, and where things were out of kilter with the market. The plan now is, the council did generously agree to a 2% COLA. I think what's absolutely imperative from my perspective moving forward this year is to at least do 2%, maybe even get 3% this next year in the COLA for 2021. Excuse me, for 2022 when we do the budget adjustment. So perhaps I think as the council president, as you discussed, is pick up one more percentage point for the COLA this year in 21. And then I think we've got to pick up several other percentage points in a COLA, at least 2 for next year. I think you get this sort of rollover effect or this snowball effect by lack of COLA. Then I think what we need to do is really by each department, we'll start going through, and I keep using the word surgical, but very position by position, and take a look at where inequities or discrepancies exist and see what we could do about starting to correct them. As with all financial policy, it's sort of like saving for, college for your kids or for savings of any kind, or for any, you just need to take concerted, consistent actions that will accumulate over time. And the COLAs represent that, correcting salaries. This is going to be a big tool for us. So I'll be asking all of the department directors to identify discrepancies, and a day and myself and Jean and the directors will be doing that. So that's really, that's the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, council, any other discussions? All right. Well, we'd like to thank our presenters today. You did a great job, Cabot Dow and Associates, and Ms. Sheeks, thank you very much. And you just did a phenomenal job. I can't begin to, on behalf of the council and all the city employees. We just want to say what a thorough, thoughtful job you did. This is once you dive into this, I know that the council will agree and has agreed, where I could tell from their questions, this is a lot of work and it's complicated. And we just really, and it goes to the very core of really our community's appreciation for the work that the people who work for the city on behalf of the citizens do. So this document's going to be very important for us. For those of you who are at home, it feels like it feels a little bit like a smaller phone book, what you've put together. But you've given us really a playbook moving forward. Council, any other feedback you'd like to give Cabot Dow and Ms. Sheeks? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. We'll be in touch. Council, we've got about 17 minutes before our next council meeting. Thank you very much for a great and productive session, and we'll be adjourned. I don't have my gavel here with me. But we'll be adjourned for the next about 15 minutes before we reconvene for the bigger city council meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.